Welcome to the Holy Post. Immediately after last week's school shooting in Nashville, opportunists used it to advance their favorite culture war narratives. Why does this seem to happen after every tragedy, and why are we more likely to empathize with victims that we identify closely with? Then, what impact will Donald Trump's indictment have on the 2024 presidential race? Are his evangelical supporters finally ready to move on? And can preaching really undo the damage and division caused by cable news and social media? Caitlin interviews the authors of a new book called Preaching to a Divided Nation, a 7-step model for promoting reconciliation and unity. All of that, plus Levi's goes AI and Christian is having none of it. Before we get into the episode, a reminder that we have a boatload of new content exclusively for Holy Post supporters. We recently answered a question from listeners about spiritual warfare. We did a bonus interview with Dr. Peeler and Dr. Jones about gender and theology. And this week we have a brand new episode of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess about baptism. Have you ever wondered why some churches baptize infants and others baptize adults or middle schoolers? There's some very interesting history and theology behind it all that we unpack for you on this new episode. If you're a fan of the Holy Post, then you should join our community of supporters. Not only will you be helping us make more great content to reach more people, but you'll get access to loads of bonus interviews, shows, merchandise, the Holy Post book club, and our monthly live stream. So go to holypost.com and click Support Us to learn more. All right, here is episode 559.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is the Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer, and I am here today with the inestimable guide to all things France, Christian Taylor. Hi,
Hey,
Christian.
Phil, how are you?
Good. And the inestimable guide to the inside of the Death Star, Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
Hi. Christian, you were in Paris in the last 2 weeks?
I was in the Paris just the last few days. Yes.
Oh, my goodness. When did you get back?
A very interesting situation over there. I don't
how
know
were
if
the
you
riots?
Heard, but yeah, there were a lot of riots over there while I was there. One of the most
fun.
interesting things is when we landed and we were picked up, we knew the riots were happening, but they weren't really big and nobody knew how they were going to affect anybody. And they didn't affect us at all until we got out of the airport and we were driving away. We saw all of these protesters stopping the off-ramp to the airport. And so all of the people going to catch planes just had to get out of their car and walk like, I don't know, a mile or more to the airport. It was awful.
Wow.
And then we were going to go to the Louvre and the protesters shut it down. So all the people that bought tickets going there just could not get in because the protesters shut that down. And then one whole day, they kind of shut down the city. So we had to stay in our hotel or right around it. And they were very, very angry because they do not want to retire later.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the whole thing is about moving the retirement age from 62 to 64, which to much of the rest of the world is a little bit like, really? That's what you're going to, you're going to burn down the Eiffel Tower for that? Really?
Look, it made me wonder what the French Revolution was like. And I started thinking about, the Parisians or the French and just how much they have done these protests for so many years.
Yeah.
And I find it kind of felt like I was in a little bit of window into history.
Oh boy. That's okay. Well, I'm glad you came out with your head that the
Me too.
they did. At what point are they so angry that they actually pull out the guillotine again and just say,
Well, we'll
all right,
see.
we
I
gotta do
hope
this again.
I hope Macron is protecting his neck.
Macron.
They're not happy with him.
Macron. Okay, here's the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Christian. I've got something stuck in my Macron. Skye, how was your 2 weeks? Did you do spring break? You went somewhere. Where'd you go?
We went to Florida.
Oh, okay. Okay. Did you Disney or did you Orlando or did you Ocean?
Ocean. We oceaned.
Yeah. Okay.
Was it warm?
Yeah, we had pretty good weather. Where we were, which is more the panhandle, it's kind of hit and miss this time of year, but we were fortunate. We had good weather.
Yeah.
What was the most interesting thing on your trip?
I for the first time played pickleball.
Oh,
What a sight for my mind.
wow.
Yes, I learned how to play pickleball,
Do you
which
feel
I
like-
really enjoyed,
Do
actually.
you feel like you're one of the cool kids now, or do you
I
feel
kind of
like
do.
okay, it wasn't just peer pressure, like you have to do the latest thing? We're not.
No, I mean, there was definitely a group that was into it, but I felt like I am now like accepted as middle-aged. Like I am a pickleball
Right.
player.
Are you
I
sure
am
it's-
ready to enter into the other half of my
Hey,
life.
Are you sure it's
pickleball is for
middle-aged?
all ages.
Is it?
That's true, but
Is
you
it
know,
really? Is it really?
Yes.
I don't know. Okay.
And I'm not surprised you like it. People get addicted to it. Do you think you'll play again?
for sure. Yeah, I think Amanda needs to try it too, and then we can do like casual pickleball games with other couples, maybe, or some of the games I was a part of. They were like fairly intense. Like these are folks who really know what they're doing.
Is it really just tennis for people who don't want to move quite so far?
It's kind of like this isn't fair, but it reminds me of ping pong, except you're like standing on the table
Yeah.
because
Right.
you either hit the ball too hard or too soft and fail. You have to have it's just the finesse of it. Like in ping pong, you can play a casual game of ping pong, or you can play like a hyper intense game of ping pong where people are, like the Olympic ping pongers. And
Like
the same thing with
Forrest
pickleball.
Gump.
You can play a casual pickleball game or like a super intense one, and yeah, it's good.
But why not just badminton?
No.
It's not as fun, not as action packed.
You got to run all around.
And you have to play with something called a birdie.
I know, but you
that's
have
weird.
to swing so stinking hard to get it to go anywhere. Oh,
no-
what 5?
Not fun.
Okay.
When I think of badminton, I think of people like in New England wearing sweaters and white shorts, but before they have a cocktail with a woman named, I don't know, Birdie.
Mildred.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. That's a very specific association. We will leave you with that. We need to talk about. I got an update from the world of artificial intelligence. Everyone's been saying, like people like Elon Musk for years have been saying, AI is going to be a big problem. AI is going to be a big problem. And we're like, well, come on, no, technology is always good. When has technology ever turned against us? That's ridiculous. Okay, so we have some visibility on things AI is going to do that are not as good. Levi's will supplement human models with AI-generated fake models. Levi's is partnering with an AI company on computer-generated fashion models to, quote, supplement human models. The company frames the move as part of a digital transformation journey of diversity, equity, inclusion, and sustainability.
I'm calling BS on this, and I'm going to tell you why right now.
Okay.
They can have as much diversity and inclusion as they want. All they have to do is call their marketing and talent agents, and they can find talent all over the world. The issue is actors are more expensive to pay than AI generated images, and so. I'm a little hot under the collar about that because every single thing I do basically is going to be replaced, which is not happy.
Yeah, not super great. Levi's announcement about it says that the partnership with the AI company will increase the number and diversity of our models for our products in a sustainable way. See, and that's the problem with humans. I think we've discovered that the problem with humans is they're just not sustainable.
They cost more money than AI generate. It's all bottom dollar.
They die.
Yeah. Sustainable is a euphemism for cheap.
Yeah. This person who wrote this article just said flat out, Levi's is essentially hiring a robot to generate the appearance of diversity while ridding itself of the burden of paying human beings who represent the qualities it wants to be associated with its brand. We want more diversity. People are messy and require money. But it is okay. So AI is at the point.
So basically they're going with no diversity. Like they're not going with any diversity because they're not hiring any diverse people.
Visual diversity, not actual people diversity. The point is
the whole point.
Yeah, the point is it's gotten to the point where they can say, okay, AI, okay, computer, we need, a Southeast Asian woman, this age, this color hair, or this, color eyes, this weight, and she needs to be wearing Levi's 505 jeans stonewash, and that it can do that. That's
in 1 second.
Yeah, that's kind of freaky. That's freaky.
Okay, I didn't know about this story before we were recording, so I've given no thought to this. Keep that in mind, everybody, as you hear what I'm about to say.
Go for it.
But beyond just the visual representation of different constituencies, of different groups, of different consumers, isn't part of the push for diversity also a push for equity? Like we want these groups that have been marginalized or underrepresented or underpaid or underhired to be given a chance. And so for Levi's to say, we want the appearance of diversity without any of the sacrifice that requires diversity is really kind of weird. It's cheating. It's saying we want the perception that we care about everybody without actually caring about anyone.
It's disingenuous.
The only thing that I will say in defense of Levi's, and
I don't
know that I even want to say. I don't know that I even want to say that. But it's like, okay, you're buying a couch and you're wondering, what would this couch look like in my living room? And so some companies are trying to develop technology, like augmented reality. It's like, okay, you pulled up your phone and the couch is in your room. Do you like it? See, that's helpful. As opposed to, we're going to find, 4,000 different living rooms and carry this couch in and take a picture in each one and put them all on our website so you can see what it would look like in your room. So maybe this is a little bit like that, where I say, okay, there are 2 models wearing this dress. None of them look like me ethnically or, whatever, my weight, my body style, rather than trying to have
that, I can't even listen to you anymore. I'm so sorry, but I just can't, because here is the deal. They can find exactly whatever they want. Size, color, eye color, hair color, whatever they want. They can find it with whatever talent agent they are using, and they can hire them and pay them, but they don't want to do that because it may take more time to find the diverse people that they want. And it's just all comes down to money. Don't defend them.
Yeah. But hold on. How many different photo shoots can you have for every item of clothing on your, in your inventory?
Hold on, Phil. I got to call BS on that too, because we all know that we have filters now. We have apps and cameras with filters where you can augment anything. So there's no reason why you can't see one of their pairs of jeans on you.
Right. Think about the glasses people. The glasses people have had this worked out forever.
Yeah.
Right? They can show you, and then they can show your... Okay, great. We won, Skye.
All right, you won.
I agree, Christian.
You won. I must be shamed. Go ahead, shame me.
No, not you. Levi's.
Shame me.
Levi's must be shamed.
Okay.
For sure.
But I almost came to their defense. So I must
You
be
did.
shamed.
You should not have done that.
Okay.
Maybe it was Caitlin. She's much more compassionate than I am, I think.
Yeah. So last week, we did not address the shooting in Nashville, which everybody knows about, I'm sure, because we recorded 2 days before it happened. That's why we didn't talk about it last week. We had to record early because of spring break, so we weren't, it hadn't happened yet. Which always feels weird when we put out a show that we recorded right before a tragedy happens, and then we're just, like oblivious.
It's like we ignored it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we didn't ignore it. I mentioned on Twitter a couple of days ago, one of the reasons, and I think I've talked about this on the podcast, one of the reasons I don't jump in quickly to talk about tragedies is for a couple of reasons. One is just the temptation to do a hot take before you have all the information, and then the risk that you end up forcing a tragedy through the filter of your own existing narratives. So that's about Islam, and this tragedy is about Christianity, and this tragedy is about gun rights, and not as I said on Twitter, not every incident has explanatory value. Sometimes they're just tragic. But it has been interesting to see. My tendency when something like that happens is to take a step back and observe, and both to wait for more information to come in, but also to watch as other people assess the meaning of an event. And that's what I find, I mean, yes, we should all be concerned about tragedies. Seeing how people interpret them and apply them to narratives and meta-narratives is, I would rather report on that than just reporting facts about a tragedy. And one of the things that, has made this one particularly, I'm not even sure what the right word is, particularly fraught with peril for interpretation is the fact that it was appears to have been a transgender shooter going after a Christian school. And that's two topics, Christian schools and transgender Americans that are, caught up in all sorts of culture war issues and different points of view. So we have, over the last few days, we have protests at the Capitol in Nashville about gun rights. Just, people just asking, why can't we have more gun control issues, or more gun control legislation? Because the shooter was described as having an arsenal. The police in Nashville said that the school shooter had an emotional disorder, was seeing a doctor for an emotional disorder, and also possessed a small arsenal of weapons. And one of the issues in Tennessee is they don't have the kind of red flag laws that allow someone to flag a person as, make sure this person can't access firearms because they appear to be a risk. And the shooter's parents said, they shouldn't have had any guns. We didn't know they had guns. They shouldn't have had guns. This was horrific. And they'd bought 7 guns over the prior couple of years from 5 different gun stores while being under treatment for an emotional disorder. So there's that aspect of it. We also, though, have people jumping in on the right, and the worst, and I have to bring it up because it's so bad, is Tucker Carlson went off on his show saying that this was an example of a new war between transgender people and Christianity. That effectively this was the transgender community declaring war on Christianity and seeing how that was going to manifest itself. And then I saw people in right-wing Christian Twitter saying, why is Tucker Carlson the only one brave enough to say these things? Why isn't your pastor saying these things? This is really, really ugly. Did you follow any of that stuff, Skye?
A little bit. I was on vacation trying to stay off the news, but my initial reaction, like everyone else, I suppose, is just incredible sadness. Mm-hmm. It makes you think back to Sandy Hook and Uvalde and these other elementary schools where young kids are the victims. And I just can't even begin to put myself in the shoes of those parents and others who've lost kids this way. It's just horrific. And regarding the culture war narratives that get spun around these things right away and around the shooters in these different stories, at least in this one, whoever this person was who did it, whatever their gender or their identity, it was pretty evident early on that this is a person who had some kind of emotional or psychiatric problem. And that's a pretty common theme in a lot of these shootings. And so before we get into anybody's politics or agendas or sexual identities, the common theme here is often deep psychological angst and problems. And anything we can do to prevent people in that condition from having access to guns is good for them. It's good for society. It's good for everyone. And the fact that we're not doing more, I don't even want to begin to get into the gun regulation stuff. I've done enough of that and talked enough about it. I think even the most ardent Second Amendment supporters agree that people under psychiatric care should not have access to deadly weapons. And the fact that that isn't just in place everywhere, I don't know why. It just makes no sense to me.
Yeah. I am struggling with what Tucker Carlson said about the event and how many people I'm seeing in Christian Twitter agree with him. He said, "Why are some trans people so angry, and why do they seem to be mad specifically at traditional Christians?" And then this is he said, "We can't think of any trans person who's ever been murdered by a pastor."
Okay, that's just deliberately misleading. I think the evidence would show that trans people are more often the victims of violent crimes rather than the perpetrators of it. And just because it isn't ordained clergy who are engaging in those activities, that's irrelevant. And again, I don't understand how the person's gender identity is relevant here. It just, first and foremost, this is somebody under psychiatric care who got access to deadly weapons.
Right.
That alone is what we should be focusing on, not forcing this into a culture war narrative when the culture war is not going to solve this problem. And
what do you do? What do you do as you encounter people that are embracing that kind of narrative because they've been fed, if you've been fed fear of the other for 10, 20, 30 years from whatever your source of reality is. And it's Central Americans coming across the border. It's a virus coming from China. Whatever it is, it's them out there that are the danger to real Americans or true Americans or godly Americans or whatever. The America that is supposed to be is under threat from the other. And how do you respond to people that are watching Tucker Carlson and saying, "Oh, that is so true. Why isn't my pastor brave enough to say these things?" How do you respond, Skye?
The response is to turn off Tucker Carlson. And I've said this in many talks I've given and places I've spoken. If you are listening to voices that are making you more and more afraid of your neighbors and more afraid of the people who are different than you, those voices are not leading you by the Spirit of Christ. They are leading you by the spirit of Antichrist, because we have not been given a spirit of fear, but one of freedom and power. And I don't care if they call themselves a Christian or not, if they are stoking fears, it is not the Spirit of God that is leading them. And that's what a lot of media does. It's a lot of what Tucker Carlson does. And all the examples you just gave of the other, be afraid of Asians, be afraid of Mexicans, be afraid of trans folks, whatever, like all of that is not causing Christians to love their neighbors more. They're causing them to fear them more. And in fear, we cannot obey the commands of Jesus. So my only response is turn off the voices that are making you more and more afraid. I don't care what channel they're coming from. I don't care what source they're coming from. Turn it off. It's not helping you follow the way of Christ.
Yeah. Christian, help us out.
Yeah, well, I don't have much to help other than the fact that we've had this conversation many times before, and typically I'm the one asking, what can we do? So I love your practical question, Phil, and I'm going to repeat to you what you have said to me on many different occasions. There really is nothing we can do except ask questions of those people that hold those ideas, thoughts, and values and try to engage in a discussion. Because when we see that attitude reflected, coming at them with any sort of aggressive stance or trying to convince them that they're wrong is a fool's errand. And really, the best we can do is hope to engage them, in a conversation and pray for them and encourage them to look at other sources of news. I mean, people that are watching Tucker Carlson or listening to those voices it's not in a entrenched position just about this one issue. It's many issues. And so it's nothing that we're going to change overnight. And I think thinking that we can convince somebody otherwise is a fool's errand.
Yeah. I'm concerned about our willingness to pick one moral issue that we disagree with another group about and use their position on that moral issue to kind of render them subhuman, morally speaking, and therefore, not worthy of engaging on any. So just the number of people say, well, Democrats are pro-abortion. Therefore, they don't value children. They don't value right and wrong. They don't value God. They have no moral compass. And so we should be, so even if they say, hey, let's launch some gun control measures to save the lives of children, we can say, you don't care about children because abortion. And on the other side, you see the same thing of, well, these Republicans don't care about health care. They don't care about prenatal care. They don't care about nutritional support for kids. So for them to say they care about kids because they're pro-life, obviously they're lying. So we come up with ways to declare the other side lying. They're liars.
And that's on both sides.
Yes, it is.
That's on both sides.
It is. And I'm trying to figure out how we can say, you know what? I was listening to somebody, who was it? I was about a podcast where they just said, let's just assume that just about everybody cares about children. Let's just assume that very few people in the world who aren't sociopaths don't care about children. So there must be another reason for why people are taking the policy positions they're taking.
I'm going to give you what my husband always says to me whenever we were in a fight. Early on, he would say, you are coming at me as if I am a bad person or have bad intentions. And you know that I'm not a bad person with bad intentions. So there may be another reason I disagree with you. And he said, I think we would get a lot further in our conversation if you would just assume that I'm a good person with good motives, and maybe we can find a different way to discuss this. And I think that's true here. It's very easy to other the other group. But I feel like there is a greater onus on Christians to enter into that conversation in love and compassion and graciousness and mercy and trying to understand. And I think maybe that's why you start off by talking, to the right or to Christians, Phil, because I think we do have a greater responsibility to act differently in the world.
I think it was Antonin Scalia, the Supreme Court justice, known as a staunch conservative. He was asked about how is it that he had such strong relationships with some of the other justices who were far more progressive. And I think this is a loose quote. He said something like, there are a lot of very, very good people who hold some very bad ideas. And that's the tension sometimes, is will we assume the person we disagree with about an idea is still a good person who intends well and has good motives, but simply holds what we consider to be a bad idea? That's common. I'm sure there are people who feel that way about me. I'd like them to disagree with my ideas and not assume that I am, the devil incarnate. And whether it's around guns or sexuality or some of these other culture war issues, I think some people's ideas are flawed or wrong, and yet I still believe they are inherently good people, created in the image of God, worthy of dignity and respect, and with whom I am called to share this country, and that we need to figure out a way to get along and cooperate for the common good. All of that is possible, but our media thrives on demonizing and othering and dehumanizing the opposite side. And that is not good for the country. It's not good for the souls of Christians who are called to see people as our neighbors, not our enemies. And it makes it impossible for us to solve the kinds of problems that we're seeing over and over and over again in our communities.
You were touching on one of my pet peeves, which is when, it doesn't matter what side it is, they say, Americans want this. Good Americans would see things this way. As if the other side, be it left or right, are not really Americans, or they're bad or evil Americans. And I do think that whether you're on the right or the left, most people, like you said, they care about children. Most people actually care about our country. They just have a different way of seeing how to solve problems, but totally invalidating the other people as evil gets us absolutely nowhere.
Yeah. And I'm seeing this on both sides. I watch Christian Twitter more closely than I watch, radical left progressive Twitter. So conservative Christian Twitter, there's a lot more conversation of how can we compromise with these people because these people are evil. Right. And you don't compromise with evil. And that's really, that's such a strong statement. Such a strong statement.
Why can't they see them as people? Why can't they see them as people? Like they're people. They're people that God made. But God made them. I mean, our mantra as Christians is that everybody is created in the image of God. And so we're eviling and othering people and that God made. And we are his representatives.
Technically, God made demons.
Oh, no.
So
you didn't. You didn't.
My point is, the moment you demonize people and you dehumanize them, even though they are created by God, you can justify not cooperating with them and othering them. And so I agree with you, Christian. We should treat people with dignity and respect because they are created by God and in his image. But that's exactly why the other side uses the language of demonization and demonic, because it's a way of saying, yeah, they may be creatures made by God, but they are so fallen and so evil that they are beyond our empathy or compassion. That's the whole point of that.
But you know what? Then the other side can say, these people call themselves Christians?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then it's just this cycle that we get in. And ultimately, somebody has to take the first step to act like Christ.
Yes.
And if we profess Christ, then we have to, that onus is on us.
Totally. And this is exactly why he says in Luke 6, judge not and you will not be judged, condemn not, you will not be condemned. It's not that we aren't to be discerning about right and wrong, good and evil, but it's the kind of judgment that condemns. The moment we condemn somebody, that's to pass definitive judgment on another person or group by saying they are worthless, they are beyond redemption. The moment you do that, you have escaped your human boundaries and taken upon yourself a responsibility and a judgment which only belongs rightfully to God. And that's happening all over the place when we demonize groups in our politics. And for Christians to do that, when Jesus explicitly forbids us from doing it, is unacceptable.
Agreed. Preach it, brother.
Preach it. Preach it. So, man, again, a huge part of this is just how America has become siloed into unique and non-overlapping realities of news media, personalities, so that we don't hear people we disagree with, or we only hear them filtered through the people we agree with. Which is even worse, because I know your argument is terrible because it was presented to me in a terrible way.
Can I ask you guys a question? Yeah, I just want to know, because I was away, I saw the headlines, but I didn't read into any of the details. Was there any sort of note or motivation for why this person targeted the school? And I'm asking that because it sounds like to me, maybe there was a lot of hurt that person felt. I did know they went to that school, and there was hurt and anger, and they wanted to get back. Did they say anything about that?
It was a former student of that school. They left a manifesto behind, which has not been publicly released, because in general it's advised not to release people's manifestos because it motivates more crimes for the purpose of getting your manifesto covered. So we don't have clear motive. And that's what the police are saying. At this time, we don't have a clear motive, other than it was a student of that school who targeted that school.
And understanding the motive is probably relevant and important for those tasked with preventing these kinds of things from happening. But to be clear, there's obviously no justification on earth for what happened. There can be no justification for murder, and especially the murder of innocents like this. So, and I agree. I think releasing that manifesto, whatever it says, publicly through the media would only reinforce what the shooter wanted in the first place. They wanted whatever their message was to be widely heard. Don't give them that reward for this evil behavior, and don't incentivize future people to act this way, thinking, well, I'm going to write a manifesto and I'm going to create a horrible massacre, and therefore my message will get publicized by the media too. It's a sick, twisted form of celebrity that we need to not reinforce with the way we cover these stories.
Absolutely. I was asking that question simply because I wonder, is there something that can be learned? So, for example, if the manifesto is ever out or, you find details of what the motive was. And it was something to the effect that this school hurt this person, or this person was rejected by people in the school, or whatever that is. I do think there are things that we can learn from, how to treat others, possibly.
Maybe.
You're shaking your head.
I
as
am,
if I'm
because
wrong.
again, let's say this person had a horrible experience at that school, and
Okay.
That's still,
There's no justification.
There's no
for
justification.
That. I know.
And then secondly, from what we do know, this person was under psychiatric care. And the fact that we don't have laws preventing people seeking psychiatric care from buying multiple very deadly weapons is just incredibly
you
stupid.
get no argument for me.
So
on that one.
there are multiple things that could have been done here before investigating, well, was this person ever bullied at school? A lot of us were bullied in school at different times for different reasons. And I'm not equating what this person
I
experienced
was beat up at school. I know what you mean.
So there's a lot of
Every
stuff.
day.
Right. So we have, this is way beyond, there's nothing that justifies what happened. And I don't want to make any of the victims of this massacre, any of the families, parents, school administrators, any of them feel any guilt or responsibility for what happened. It wasn't their fault. And they are, I don't know, the words that come to me are sort of pastoral, but they are precious in God's eyes given the pain that they are going through. And the last thing in the world we need to do is turn the focus on what did the school do wrong, rather than what did this person and what did society do wrong that allows this to keep happening over and over again.
Oh no, it's the bat phone.
It is the bat phone, and I don't want that to take away from the good thing you just said. So let me hang up.
Oh no.
Sorry. Skye, you're 100% right. You're right. I stand corrected.
No, I don't think it's wrong to be curious about the manifesto, but I think the only people who really need to know it are those tasked with preventing these things in the future. We don't all need to know what's in that manifesto.
Right. We don't need to make a public thing of it. And regardless of what it is, people are going to use it to try to fit into pre-existing narratives.
Right.
Which is your point.
Yeah, that advance a cause that they were already committed to. And because we're so fallen in that regard, that something bad that happens, I must use it in a way that makes me feel better about myself and the positions that I've already taken, that reinforces, presuppositions and prejudice that I already have. And that was one of the things I said, why I tend not to ever do hot takes on tragedies, is because the first thing that's going to come out of me is going to be based on my own prejudices, my own narratives. And I want to stop.
Well, and your emotions.
And my emotions. I want to stop, drop, and listen, and actually see.
Well, and the other dynamic, and this is not unique to mass shootings, but it happens when there's an earthquake or a hurricane or whatever horrible event occurs. When we face seemingly random and chaotic events, our human instinct is we need to make sense of this. And the way we make sense of things is we place them into a narrative. We create a story that explains why it happened. And I think after these kinds of mass shootings, especially the school shootings in which children are the victims, we're so horrified by it, we immediately want to feel some level of comfort by making sense of it. And therefore, we immediately weave a narrative that explains why it happened, and that narrative is then concocted based on where you stand, on the right or on the left, on these various issues. And it's a grief mechanism. It's a way of feeling secure in an otherwise chaotic world. I get why we do that. The problem is when people with large microphones and television cameras and audiences do that in an irresponsible way. That's what's happening all over the place.
Yeah, and I also am very wary of how some tragedies hit closer to home for you. And when you look back at why did this one impact me so much? Quite often it's like the people that were impacted by this tragedy are in my own socioeconomic class, and their kids look like my kids. And that was, I saw an image of, some of the kids on a bus being driven away, and, one of them's just sobbing on the bus, these, 8, 9-year-old kids. And that really hit me because 8, 9-year-old kid looked like my granddaughter. And then I have to realize, what if that kid didn't look like my granddaughter? Would that be less tragic? So I just want to shut up. Yeah. Go ahead, Christian.
I'm just saying, to your point, this past week, there were 2 helicopters that crashed in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I don't know if you guys heard that or not. It was a training exercise. My son Hunter is training to fly helicopters in Florida as we speak, and he's trying to do an inter-service transfer to get transferred into that unit. When I heard that, and over the last week, I just can't get it out of my mind, and it's in my heart, and I'm worried. And to your point, Skye, you really do want to find something that you can control or some way to grab a hold of that to process that pain or that chaos. And you're right, Phil. I think when it's in our neighborhood, something that we can relate to, we want to take even more action somehow.
Yeah, we want people to be more outraged. We want people to be as outraged as I am by something that I feel uniquely, associated with. And typically, I'm associating myself with it subconsciously. I'm not aware of why Sandy Hook affected me more than Uvalde. Or why a Christian school full of upper middle class, white suburban Christians would affect me more than an inner city shooting. And I just be quiet until you can check, your presuppositions and your prejudices and the subconscious stuff that's going on. And that's partly because I'm a rational personality type. I lead with my brain, not with my heart, or which my wife will say, yeah, good in some cases, not great in other cases. But it's helpful when you're analyzing news because it's, if you follow your heart into a news story, you're following.
You'll be like the mom that ended up on television in front of the cameras. Did you see her? I mean, I can't imagine what she while that was happening, there was a whole, group of photographers, and she was a mom at the school, and she just ran in front of the microphone and said, "Aren't you sick of covering this?" She kind of, and I'm sure she was emotional, and she probably has had to experience some sort of, effects of that rash emotional choice in the moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not a bad response to say to the news media, "Aren't you sick of covering this?" I'm not going to vouch that response.
No. I'm not saying she's bad. I'm just.
Yeah. I just.
Yeah. I'm not saying she's bad. She just stuck herself in there.
I don't want to say this tragedy is the one that everyone should care about the most, as opposed to there have been 90 school shootings so far this year.
And we've probably talked about 5 over the course of the.
Yeah. So why are you choosing the ones you're choosing? Well, I don't want to curate the news based on my own prejudice, basically.
It also explains the divergent responses to a lot of the police shootings or killings of unarmed young black men, whether you're talking about Trayvon Martin or Ahmaud Arbery or Floyd. Like it's the black community looks at those videos and people go, that could have been me. And they understandably react. And a bunch of white people look at that and go, oh, that's not me. That's not someone I know. That's not my community.
Couldn't have been me.
And there's a lack of outrage and call for action. And so one of the things we just need to cultivate more of throughout this country is the ability to empathize with people who are different than ourselves, who don't share our faith, who don't share our ethnicity, who don't share our socioeconomic status, who don't share our sexual identity, and still see them as a child of God and empathize with their pain and rally resources and make changes to help them. And when it comes to these shootings, I mean, I've had numerous podcast episodes on this whole topic, but I think we've gotten into this place where we think of these shootings almost like natural disasters, where there's a sense of, oh, it's terrible and we're all sad about it, but what can you do? There's nothing it's an act of God. This is not an act of God. This is an act of human society. We have created a society with 450 million guns. We have created a society in which we don't regulate them nearly enough. We have created a society where we have collectively agreed that this amount of death through gun violence, both suicide and murder, is acceptable. We have chosen this, and we can choose to make it different, but we're not going to. There's no evidence that we're going to. So I wish we would cover these things not as acts of God, the way we do natural disasters, but we covered them as evidence of a sick and toxic society, which is what it is.
Yeah, and I want to point out last thing, and then we need to wrap up. The use on I'm both. Some people don't like it when you both sides. Some people say stop both sidesing.
Right, because that includes them.
And what's interesting is that both sides believe it is wrong to both sides because the other side is so much worse.
Right.
I honestly, I hear that every day. Don't both sides because that side is worse.
Right.
There is no moral equivalence, and both sides say it. Both sides are saying that both sidesing is wrong. Wah!
Shocking.
So sue me. I'm both sidesing. I hear, on one side that, the left is hypocritical when they call for gun control because they don't care about abortion. And I hear on the other side that the right is hypocritical when they say they're pro-life because they don't call for gun control. And the result is that we both give ourselves a reason to not believe the good intentions of the other side on the causes they care about. And because they don't have good intentions, I am not going to work with them. On the left, I am not going to work for compromise on abortion because their intentions aren't even to do good. And on the right, I'm not going to compromise about gun control because their intentions aren't even to do good because they don't care about abortion.
And is it just coincidence that if you did compromise on either side, you'd probably lose your reelection bid to a primary opponent who's further to the right or left than you are? Just
Totally
coincidence?
Totally coincidence.
Or your advertisers or your audience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, a former president is indicted and may have to go to trial. What do you think about that? Any thoughts?
I still remain so skeptical that anything will make a difference.
Uh-huh. Well,
Teflon Don.
I think I agree with those who say the indictment probably hands him the primary.
Yes.
Yeah, it'll be good for him. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he thrives. He thrives on grievance and victimization, and this fits that narrative perfectly.
And so does his audience.
And there's no evidence that even his primary opponents are coming out against him. They're backing him in this.
Right.
So
right. It's too risky not to. It's too risky not to because I hate to say it, there is no more Republican Party. There is just a cult that most of the base is a cult of personality around one insane individual.
Now, here's the only thing. We're recording this on Monday. He's being arraigned on Tuesday, I believe.
Yeah.
And we haven't actually seen the content of the indictment. If the content is really all about the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels, I think this is kind of a nothing burger. I don't think it's going to.
There are 30 counts.
I know,
are 30 counts,
but they could all just be 30 counts of records where this was marked down as incorrectly. If there's actually substantive fraud allegations regarding his businesses and beyond the Stormy Daniels payment, maybe this has some legs to it. When I say legs, I don't mean like legally. I'm no lawyer. I don't know, but I'm saying among. Politically, will it actually sway people to give up on Trump?
Yeah.
I don't know if it will.
I will say this. I have known a lot of people that were on the Trump train, and many of them are no longer on the Trump train. Like they are looking for other people to vote for. And I have heard this shift of people who really don't want to follow him anymore. Now, what will this do? I don't know. It will be interesting to see. Are they going to go right back to that?
Yeah.
But for the most part, I do think many, many Republicans don't want him to be their nominee.
They do not, except that his ratings went up after the indictment was announced. And so his polling is improved. Oh, he's under attack. That means he's our guy. If he wasn't under attack, then maybe he's not our guy. Maybe he's actually incompetent at doing most of what he says he's good at doing. But he's under attack, so he's our guy. And then you also have his opponents who have to, in some way, say, we support him. Or they lose, that connection with the base and any ability to take the base away from him. So it's really a difficult
There's something
position.
important to remember as well, and that is the Republican primary system. Back in 2016, Trump did not get the majority of Republican votes in the primary, and yet he still became the nominee. And the reason is the Republicans have a winner-take-all system where even if he got 20 or 30% of the vote in a particular state, if it's more than anyone else, he gets all of the electors from that state. So that's where if the really core Trump supporters, even if they're a minority of the Republican Party, they can still get him across the finish line. The only messaging I think could possibly persuade enough Republicans to abandon Trump is if DeSantis or some other nominee comes along and says, listen, I love Donald Trump. I love all of his policies. I love how he sticks it to the liberals. I love all that he's doing, but he's not competent enough to not create self-inflicted wounds that are distracting from the work we're trying to get done. I mean, paying off a porn star or the shenanigans that went on with the Stop the Steal stuff, like he's preventing us from winning more and more because of his own undisciplined actions. DeSantis could come along and say, I'll give you everything Trump's promised, but I'm disciplined and competent. Therefore, vote for me and we won't get all these crazy circuses going on. I'll just win all the time.
That'd
that
be nice.
Might persuade people.
But there is a group of people that are, the ticket they're buying is to the crazy circus.
Yeah, there is.
Okay.
I remember when Trump was president, I would wake up every day and check the news. And the first thought in my head was, let's see what's happening in Crazy Town.
Yeah.
It's not great when you can't get out of it, though, when you are stuck in Crazy Town, which we all were.
Right, when the airport closes and there's no leaving, and you just have to keep walking around Crazy Town ducking. Okay, I am going to wrap it up here. It's not a political podcast, but seeing how the church is interacting with political forces on the far right is continuing to concern many, and we keep talking about it. And we have a great guest today. You're really going to enjoy it. Thank you, Patreon supporters, for supporting us so we can do this. We have a new employee. His name is Mike, and he's helping us do everything behind the scenes. And you're paying him, so we really appreciate it. And we will see you next week. Bye. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. Life is not easy. Relationships are hard. Parenting is hard. Being the child of parents is hard. I've found a trained therapist can be a wonderful sounding board for working through the ups and downs of living in a fallen world as fallen people. Faithful Counseling is a Christian counseling service with more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, with access by video or phone sessions or even chat and text, with expertise in depression, stress, anxiety, trauma, family conflicts, and more. It's more affordable than traditional counseling, and financial aid is available for those who qualify. We all need to talk to someone sometime, and Faithful Counseling can help. Continue growing into the best version of yourself. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling that you need. They've even got a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode.
All of the Holy Post hosts, does that make us holy hosts or post hosts? Anyway, all of the Holy Post hosts come from church traditions where preaching is pretty central, and I'm guessing that's true of a lot of our audience as well. We gather as a community of believers and we sing some songs, but the majority of our time gathered together is spent with one person opening up God's Word and teaching or preaching to us about what it contains. But is preaching still effective? Does it still mold and shape God's people? And what about the hours and hours every week we spend consuming media, cable news, and social media feeds? Can preaching still bring us together and unify us as God's people when everything in the media we're consuming outside of church is really trying to divide us and pit us against one another? We've talked about some of those issues before on the show, but they're addressed especially in a new book by Dr. Matthew Kim and Dr. Paul Hoffman called Preaching to a Divided Nation, a 7-step model for promoting reconciliation and unity. In this conversation, Caitlin talks to both of them about how they think about preaching, how it fits into the larger formative calling of the church, and what does pastoral, courageous preaching look like that doesn't shy away from difficult topics and addresses the idols of our culture, including politics, in a way that actually brings us together as God's people rather than further apart. Dr. Matthew Kim is professor of practical theology and pastoral leadership at Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University, and Dr. Paul Hoffman is the senior pastor of Evangelical Friends Church of Newport, Rhode Island, and an adjunct professor at Berkeley College. Here is their conversation with Caitlin Chess about preaching that can unite us rather than divide.
Thank you both so much for joining today, Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Kim. I'm so excited about this book. I feel like these topics are topics we talk about a lot on the podcast, but we don't often get to talk so specifically about preaching. We have a lot of pastors and a lot of people who preach who listen, but I don't think we spend a lot of time talking about these questions. So I'm excited to get into them with y'all. Let's start with kind of both of you. Just tell me how this book came into being, and maybe even for each of you, if there's been a moment in your ministry, in your life, in your teaching that you realized this is something that we really need. Pastors and preachers really need help preaching on these kinds of topics in this kind of time.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start. Thanks for having us on, Caitlin. We just so appreciate your work, and the research you're doing is really significant. For me, it was actually probably a little bit similar to some of your journey around the 2016 election, from what I understand of your journey. And in particular, it was the Access Hollywood video that came out where we heard about candidate Trump saying some things I will not repeat here, and about his approach to women or things he had claimed to do to women. And I just remember listening to some of it, and I was infuriated. And I told my wife I wanted to post something pastorally on Facebook, that the way that the candidate Trump spoke about women was despicable, it was dishonorable. I just wanted to speak into the situation pastorally, morally, not, who am I voting for? But my wife kept cautioning me. She said, Paul, don't do it. Paul, don't do it. And she's almost always right, and ended up posting a link to an article about it. And I just had a couple comments. This is disgusting. This is reprehensible. And it just blew up on Facebook. And I actually had a pastor acquaintance of mine who, in a thread on Facebook, was literally railing on 2 of my parishioners, people he'd never met. And he was attacking them for their position. And the irony was I was probably more in agreement with him and his approach, but the way he went about it was unfortunate. And eventually, after about 40 minutes, this thing just grew longer. I had to take it down. And I did feel a bit of guilt and shame. But it was one of those moments where it just clicked into me. We are, as a nation, and especially as a church, because most of these were Christians, to my knowledge, we are deeply, deeply polarized. And we're going to be in for some rough sledding in the years to come.
Yeah, Dr. Kim, what about you?
Well, this book was actually Paul's idea. And so every time that question is asked, I give Paul all credit. So Paul, you can thank me later. Basically, Paul had written a paper for the Evangelical Homiletic Society and done really well with that paper. And so he wanted to expand that into a book project. And when he approached me about it, I thought, yeah, this sounds fantastic. So we went for it, and thankfully the editors at Baker Academic agreed that it was a book that would be helpful and necessary for our society, and especially for the church. And so I'm not a really gung-ho political person. I know what the Bible says about politics, and I want to be a good steward in that regard. But what we really want to accomplish is to have unity in the church, and we want to be able to have differing sides and polar opposites come to the resolution that Jesus is Lord. At the end of the day, this world is our temporary home, and we need to be able to make it work. And just as Jesus commanded us in his high priestly prayer in John 17, we are to be first and foremost disciples who love each other. So that's the hope, that's the goal. And if this book can contribute to that, that's, praise God, that's what we're hoping for.
That's great. Thank you. Before we get into some of the specifics about kind of the method that you all have described here, which I think is really important, let's start with just a general question about how preaching can shape or form communities. I think on the podcast, we talk a lot about how we fear that in our churches, preaching has been too elevated, that we haven't thought of communion and baptism and other communal practices as central to the service of the church on Sunday mornings. And we also, I think, outside of the podcast, I think people in general have questioned, as you talked about, Dr. Hoffman, in 2016 and 2020, can preaching really shape congregations? It seems like, a preacher has this one moment. It's not very long, depending on the tradition or type of church. And then they go home and they've got hours of cable media that they're consuming or social media that they're on. And I think a lot of people are wondering, is preaching even something that can shape and form communities towards the good things that y'all are describing? Or is it something that it's just, we should keep doing it every week, but it isn't really able to kind of form? How can preaching kind of overcome those challenges in y'all's mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. We really appreciate that, Caitlin. I think it's a both and. We still are both very much convinced in the power of God's word rightly preached, that there's something about when we bring the word of God before a congregation, that God, through the power of the Holy Spirit, through the unction of the Spirit, can, in a way that I can only describe as supernatural, apply it into the hearts and the lives of people, and that it can bring radical, transformational change, gospel change. So we believe in that. However, at the same time, we also recognize what you recognize in your book, that if we only have people for an hour a week, if that's all they're getting is an hour of worship a week, and then the rest of the week they're being discipled by cable TV and by their social media echo chambers, we are, as pastors and preachers, facing an uphill battle. So it's more than just preaching. It's also the whole ecosystem of formation and discipleship that the local church, whatever its tradition is, creates, so that we're really trying to draw people in more than just 1 hour on Sunday. So we're encouraging people to come to prayer services, or to read God's word and to interact with other people in the church, and to have confession of sin, and to serve the poor and the needy. So it really is more than just the word preached rightly. Of course, we believe that's absolutely essential, but it's going to take more than that for a follower of Jesus Christ to be fully formed in a way that our politics or any of the other isms we talk about in the book will not hijack them.
That's really helpful. And I think it reminds me of another thing that I really appreciated about the book, was that on one level, and like I said, we'll get into it, but on one level, this is about preaching, about the theology, about the process. But it also, there were so many things that I thought, this is also just about pastoring. Like, some of this is not about the moment on Sunday morning that you're preaching. Dr. Kim, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between preaching and pastoring, and kind of the word that you all would give to someone who, wants to do this kind of faithful preaching, but might be tempted to think of it as maybe exclusively or primarily about really getting the words of the sermon down for Sunday morning?
Yeah, Caitlin, that's a great question and observation. Paul and I are not saying that we need to preach on one of the isms every week. That would be disastrous for your ministry.
Amen.
We're not advocating for that at all. What we are advocating for is a holistic ministry that has multiple prongs, so that you can preach, you can counsel, you can have small group ministry, discipleship, serving the least of these. All of it is intended to be a church culture that really, through the pulpit, gives a vision. It casts a vision through the sermon to be able to have a church that is unified on the essential doctrines of the faith. And what we want to do is have the entire church get on board with that mission, so that these things that we have made idols don't become obstacles for ministry. And unfortunately, as we all know, that's what it's become. The idols have taken over our lives, and the idols have usurped or surpassed our centrality of Christ at the center. And so preaching definitely is one medium that God uses, but God uses everything to be able to make disciples. So we're not advocating only for the preaching moment. We're not saying that the preaching moment has everything to do with how we, as long as I preach a grand slam sermon on politics or gender, we're going to solve all of the earth's problems. That's not what we're advocating for. But at the same time, I think you're right. We do want to get the wording right. We do want to make sure that the text is interpreted faithfully and accurately. We do want to make sure that the application is spot on for how our church is dealing with these issues. So the two go hand in hand. We preach the word for vision and unification, giving people the reminder of who we are as Christians and what comes first. But then we also want to think about how do we use other ministries to be able to make that holistic moment happen so that our church can really be unified as Jesus intended.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. And one of the things that I have been convicted of a little bit lately, I occasionally go and preach at churches. It's not part of my normal kind of vocational life. I'm a student, but I feel really very deeply the fact that I'm pretty limited if I show up on a Sunday morning to preach a sermon in what I can really know of this people and what kind of word I can give. And sometimes pastors will ask me to come because they kind of want an outsider to say the hard thing for a minute, gives them some cover. But I feel really deeply the sense that what I can give is so much more limited than what someone who is in that community and understands it well can give. And one of the things, again, I really loved about the book, you have these 7 steps. The second step is the contextual step, where you talk about knowing both God's word and the world that we live in, the history of America, the history of the local church and the area that it's in, that specific congregation. Can you talk a little bit about, either one of you, about how a pastor, or even I think this could apply, this part of the step at least could really apply to Sunday school teachers or people who are just serving in the church, how they could go about learning the history of the place they're in. And I love the language that you use in the book of identifying the local idols. We talk sometimes on the podcast about the national questions, the evangelical church very broadly, that can be helpful. But what I'm so convicted of often is that really pales in comparison in my mind to what a pastor who can say, in this church, this is the problem, or this is the area that we're tempted to fall in too much in one direction or the other. For someone who's listening and says, I really want to do that, but how do I learn the history, or how does the history inform the local idols, or how do I know what those local idols are? How would you encourage them to think about discerning those kinds of questions?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I would say that pastoring in Denver, Colorado, there were some obvious idols, such as when people were on their phones during my sermon, during the sermon time, during the Broncos games, scrolling through what the score was. I saw the tops of a lot of people's heads. You knew what the local idol was, which was the Denver Broncos. But beneath the surface, there were other idols. And in that particular congregation, I love them dearly, and so this is not an indictment against them in any way. But many people struggle with gambling, and there was a gambling addiction in our church, and it was a pervasive one. And that's not something you just pick up right away. Those habits, behaviors, sins take time to get to know. And for that particular congregation, there were a number of people who struggle with gambling. And how do you know that? You hear that through conversation. You hear that through personal confession. You hear that through different moments of being a pastor. And so how do you learn about the local idols? It's through observation. It's through reading the local newspaper. It's through reading the church's minutes. If these days a lot of churches don't do meticulous note-taking for minutes, but if your church is more historic or follows that kind of tradition. But Paul would know this better because he's a local church pastor right now. But those are some initial thoughts about how we can actually think about getting to know the local idols, because it comes up in conversation. It happens around the lunch table. It happens in the fellowship hall. As you hear conversations happening, you get to pick up on some of these things that people are really gravitating toward.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would agree what Dr. Kim's saying, just about knowing your people. Nothing will replace FaceTime. Not as a iPhone, but face-to-face discipleship, conversations, cup of coffee, pastoral visit. Nothing can replace that. But in my case, when I first moved to Newport, Rhode Island in the beginning of 2007, I approached the area a little bit like a cultural anthropologist. So I had people encourage me. They said, go meet with other pastors who've been doing this longer. Ask them, what are the prevailing sins in this area? What are the patterns, you're seeing here? What's going on? Tell me about this place. Tell me about your experience with this place. I also visited the non-for-profits. So, for example, I visited the Martin Luther King Jr. Center, where they serve a lot of people that struggle with housing and food insecurity. And I asked the director there, brilliant woman named Amanda, Harvard educated. I just said, what are the weaknesses? What are the struggles of this community? And she just talked about how polarized our community is between the rich and the poor. We have a very thin middle class, and we have a lot of people that are on government welfare or government assistance programs, and then we have a lot of very wealthy people that vacation here in the summer that live in New York and DC. So literally within a mile or two, you have a $15 million mansion, and then over here you have Section 8 housing. So I treated it like an anthropologist. Then I just walked the streets. I have some more in the charismatic tradition that said, Paul, you need to walk the streets and ask the Holy Spirit to help you discern what's going on. So go to the part of the town that people claim they're too afraid, or, the places they say don't go there. Walk through those places, pray through those places and discern. Ask God to show you. And as you prayer walk with your eyes and your mind and your spirit and your heart open, God will show you different aspects of what's going on in that community, both the beauty of the community, because there is beauty, and also the brokenness.
That's really helpful. I mean, I think, like I said, a lot of people, when I was in seminary only a couple of years ago, we spent a lot of time talking about, how to make an outline and how to exegete the text well. And we didn't spend a lot of time talking about learning the context of the place that we were in and how that might shape, what we would say. Can you talk a little bit? One of my favorite things about the book that I had heard people say before, but I'd never heard someone talk about it in the context of preaching, was the idea of centered and bounded sets, and having that kind of approach to a difficult topic or to preaching on a difficult topic. And this is another area where I think this could be really useful for pastors, but it also could be useful for people teaching, for people having difficult conversations within their churches. I'm very aware we get messages all the time from people who say, I'm in a church that is really deeply politically divided or divided on social issues like race and gender. We're going through a big conversation about what to do about women's ordination, or a big conversation about what our role in the community should be. And I think that this concept that y'all describe, that people have used in other areas, but specifically applied to this question of dealing with these difficult topics in sermons and in the church, could be really helpful. So can you talk about centered and bounded sets and kind of what that means for these difficult topics?
Yeah, so I'll start there. We encourage people to start with centered sets, and that's a sociological idea that it's about what you're looking toward. So a centered set is not about insiders and outsiders. It's about what are we facing. So are we facing Jesus Christ? It's really focusing on more of what unites us. And so we can both be facing Jesus Christ, but one may be closer because they've walked with him longer than someone else in the church that's maybe a relatively new Christian. Then after you go through the centered sets, which we outlined for, and I could let Dr. Kim talk about that, but we outlined the major centered sets, and we talk about creed and experience and different things, then move on to the bounded sets. And bounded sets are about who's in and who's out. So a bounded set would be, are you Presbyterian or not? Are you Republican or Democrat or not? And so all too often we start with the issue that's dividing us rather than going to people and say, well, wait a second, let's remind ourselves that what unites us, if we're Christians, is far greater, at least from a theological perspective, than what divides us.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. Really, what we want to focus on is the gospel. We want to focus on the essential doctrines of the faith. And so we want to think about the Great Commandment, the Great Commission. We want to think about the essential core elements of the faith. We might think of it as the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. We want to be able to articulate key doctrines that, even if we spend an entire life preaching on how we're united, it would be inexhaustible. So why are we spending so much time preaching on the division? And what we can really focus on is Jesus, the gospel, the Trinity, the things that God has commanded us to do and to be light and salt, and to care for orphans and widows, and to care for the least of these. And even in those things, I think there's so much richness that unites us. We want to start with centered sets and not begin with bounded sets. But bounded sets, of course, we have to talk about those too. How are we divided? And how can that division either be something that we leave as we're never going to solve this, or something that says we can solve this, and let's go back to the scripture and see what God has to say about this issue.
Amen. And just to add to that, Caitlin, if I may. So Dr. Kim's talking about one of the 4 was shared doctrines. So, before you preach on a difficult topic, you say, hey, we share the gospel. And then we also talk about the idea of shared identity. Hey, we're children of God. Like, we're all redeemed by the blood of Jesus, by the grace of God. And we are brothers and sisters. We are not combatants. We're actually, if we're in Christ, we are branches in the true vine. And then we talked about shared mission. We have the Great Commandment, the Great Commission. Every Christian's called to the Great Commandment, the Great Commission. Go and make disciples. Love God, love your neighbors yourself. And then Dr. Kim is so good at this. He's written a book on preaching to people in pain. But we also need to realize we also have shared experiences around loss, suffering, and rejection. And that's an underutilized area where people can find common ground, is that I haven't experienced anti-Asian racism like my good friend Matt has, but I do know what it's like to be rejected. I do know what it's like to have people be mean to me or rude to me, and I didn't know why. I'm not aware if I experienced any kind of racism based on the color of my skin, but I do know what rejection feels like. I do know how that sting and how that cut into my soul. And so, let's start with what connects us before we move to what divides us. But normally we start on the wrong end, and we can never get to a place of unity because we're so focused on what's dividing us.
It's really helpful. I think, again, I'm thinking both of people who are preaching and people who are just trying to work on these issues in their churches and whatever, capacity they have. And it does seem like we tend to split between the people who just say, let's just focus on the unity part. We all believe the gospel. Let's ignore these other questions. Let's focus on that. Or the people who kind of come in swinging and are like, no, it's important that we talk about these really hard things, that we talk about what divides us. And I thought it was so helpful, the description that you all give of it is important to start with the unifying things, both as a theological truth and as a strategic, like this is just a practically good thing to start with. You're not going to bring people along with you if you kind of come in swinging with the hard thing, but it also doesn't mean we don't ever get to that hard thing. And I think that's partially what I would imagine the average person who sees this book is worried about, is like, how do I know if I ever get there? Like, how do I know if it's the right moment? Maybe there's some big national thing going on. Maybe there's something happening in my church. Is this the right moment to talk about racism? Is this the right moment to talk about our political differences? We haven't really talked about this a lot yet, but is this the moment when I really start talking about money and how that's, a touchy subject for people? What would you all say to someone who says, look, I want to use the steps that you've outlined to preach a good sermon and to be a faithful pastor, but my hardest thing right now is do I go there or do I not? Is it being wise to just avoid the question? Am I trying to build up rapport before I do it? Or am I just scared? Is this the moment when I should be prophetic? Or is this the moment when I should, wait and wait for the right opportune moment? I'm sure there's no easy answer to this question, but I am curious if you all have some pastoral advice for people who are discerning. I don't want to be motivated by the wrong things. I don't want to just enjoy flipping tables for fun, but I also don't want to let fear prevent me from saying the hard word and for my people that really need it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This takes a lot of prayer. If I were to say anything, start with prayer and talk to your leadership, talk to your pastoral staff if you have pastoral staff, talk to your elders or deacons. And this is not something that you do flippantly. That's not what we're trying to call for. It's also not something that you want to just do just because you feel like it. It needs to be, as Paul talks about it in various parts of the book, a kairos moment versus a chronos moment. And like you were saying, Caitlin, it really has to do with being prayerful and knowing that this is the moment. If I miss this moment, I'm never going to get it back. And sometimes we preach like that in terms of national tragedies or world disasters. And sometimes we miss those key moments where we could have really spoken God's truth into these people's lives to encourage them and give them hope. And that's what we're trying to ask people to consider is don't do this just because you feel like it or it's a fad or people are doing it, so I got to do it. This is something that is particularly contextual to your church. And so if your church is really divided over gender, maybe in the next 6 to 12 months, it might be something that you could address. If it's classism or any of the isms that we talk about in the book, an obvious time would be to talk about politics before elections, of course, and seize that moment and do it prayerfully. And so we're not advocating for ad hoc, just do whatever you want, anytime you want, a la carte kind of preaching style, or moment. But we're really advocating for prayerful pastoral leadership on these important but difficult topics. So that would be our encouragement. And I don't know if Paul has something to add there.
Yeah, no, I think you've said it well, Matt. One tip would just be make sure if you're triggered, is this a you as the pastor thing, or is this something my people need to hear? Because maybe if we're sensitive to our people, maybe I don't want to address this issue, but the people in my church are upset, and I need to wade into this situation. Or is this more just me that it's hitting something in me and I'm triggered? And maybe it's more me than the rest of the church. So it does take discernment. We also, list practices like take a SWOT analysis. I have a lot of military in my church, a lot of military officers that are studying at the U.S. Naval War College, and they taught me about the SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So that's one of the ways. It's a grid that we can use to say, is this the time? Is this the topic? Is this the time? What could be the outcome? What is good about this, but what is potential pitfalls? So it does take prayerful wisdom and discernment and collective. It's not just on the pastor. I do believe we have to bring in leaders and people in the church that are bellwethers that can speak the truth in love to us and be like, it's too hot right now, but this needs to be addressed in the near future.
Yeah, I love, I think it's the third step of your 7-step model, the personal step that includes, as you've just described, this intentional move to be reflective about not just the history of the congregation or the country or the area, but for the pastor or the preacher to say, like, how does my history, how do my wounds from my past influence how I'm ministering, how I'm preaching? And again, it's only been a few years since I was in seminary, and I felt like there was not enough conversation about what we were bringing to ministry with us. Like, there were some people that I feared were trying to kind of fix their own past or deal with their own, kind of issues with the church by jumping into ministry. And I love that part of your description of this personal step is not just evaluating your own histories, but having accountability, having, as you just said, people in your life that can point that out to you. Really practically, how would you all encourage a pastor, especially I can imagine, I'm not a pastor right now, but I can imagine someone thinking, I feel pretty alone. Like maybe I'm not at a church that has it built in well for me. I don't think it's appropriate for me to kind of rehash some of this stuff with a congregant maybe, or I don't know how to build accountability around me. I think we spent a lot of time recently talking about church abuse scandals or other kind of abuse of power issues. And I don't know that we talk enough about really practically, if you're someone who finds yourself in a position of spiritual authority over people, how would you all counsel them to go about doing this work of self-reflection and putting in place the kind of things that could keep them accountable?
That's an easy question. So Paul, why don't you answer?
You're right. I appreciate it. What a good fit. No, Matt and I talked a lot about this. We've personally had the benefit of having the same mentor. Not only did we study together at Gordon Conwell, but we've had a mentor, Dr. Scott Gibson, who teaches at Baylor and Truett Theological, and he's mentored us. He's been very intentional. We both placed ourselves under his authority, but he's been very intentional and following up with us and supporting us and over the years. So I do think finding a mentor, and that takes work. It's a two-way street. We care for him and we reach out to him and we pray for him, but he's also done the same for us. So I think seeking a mentor, it could be an older pastor figure. It could be maybe a professor from the past that we want to follow up with and re-secure that. It could be a coach. Caitlin, I really do believe in coaching. Matt and I both have a good friend, Casey Barton, who, as part of the Covenant movement, he has a spiritual director. So I really believe in the importance of having a coach, a mentor, and or a spiritual director, maybe all three, making sure they're not conflicting what advice they're giving you. But we all need people that we can speak to in an unbiased, or someone that doesn't need our approval, that we submit to, and they're willing to say the hard things to us. They'll ask us, how's your soul? And they're not going to settle for pat answers. But Caitlin, that's not easy, cheap, quick. That's not something you just find overnight. It takes time, effort. It takes investment. But in the end, what has motivated Matt and I over the years is this idea of homiletical maturity, that we're called into the image of Christ. We're the imago Christi, as the word goes. And so for me, it's been 2 Corinthians 3. I'm called to be conformed and transformed into the image and likeness of Jesus Christ, to be sanctified to the place where one day I'm glorified and Christ is fully formed in me. So that's the ultimate end. I'm going to stand before God as someone who is accountable for his life, his doctrine, and his ministry. And so that motivates me. And I have to do a lot of investment. I have mentors, pastor mentors, I have professor mentors, I have denominational mentors, I have peers, friends I can unburden myself with, I trust. I have a wonderful wife. I've had over the years counselors and coaches, depending on the season. And those people poured into me. And I shudder to think what would have happened had I not had that web of relationships to hold me fast during some of the hardest, darkest seasons I've been through.
If I may add there, I would say that there's nothing wrong, and I think we should get it out into the open that there's nothing wrong with mental health, getting help for mental health issues. And I've just recently gone through a difficult season, which led to mental illness. And I had never thought that I would experience something like this, but I did. And it was all under God's sovereign plan for me to experience a real dark time prior to teaching at Truett. And I was actually on medical leave for 7 or 8 months prior to starting my work. And God miraculously healed me. But this is the first time I've ever explored my own personal life, and to see that I had gone into this darkness and this moment of hopelessness and anxiety, depression, all of that hit me very, very hard over the last year. And these are the things that we don't like to talk about and don't talk about enough, but we really want to advocate for seeking a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and to get the therapy that we need so that we can minister for the long haul.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Kim. I think that will in and of itself be a good word for people who might be cautious about reaching out for help. Thank you both so much for this. I really hope, like I said, that these steps and the method you've outlined can be helpful to pastors that are trying to address these issues in their churches. So thank you.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.